Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the table, right? Thanks, Mike. Does such a great job
Michelle?
of playing that song, huh?
Michelle for a
And
beautiful
Michelle,
solo.
yes, great. Sorry. I love that song in the first verse. I never picked it up before, but to the table and bringing hope. And last night I said about hope. And I hope each of us can take a little bit of that nugget back home with us and share it. Because, we talked also about the Denmark email that we got from the lady that was in Denmark. And this morning, or this afternoon, when another guy came in, he shared another story. And it's just great to hear everybody's stories of what's happening in their lives and things that have impacted them. And this guy said that we have these banners up. You saw the sign out here with the two banners that we have for the conference. And we had one at another church down along Route 4 before you go across the bridge. And he just shared with me today that they got a letter, the church got a letter about that sign being on their property. And obviously, you can see the first big word, top left corner of that banner says sex. And they did not believe that the church should have a banner that says sex like that on their property. And they didn't think it was appropriate, because how do we talk to our kids or our families about sex? Well, that's the whole purpose, to be able to share that with our families and to take it to the church and to open those conversations. And this person that wrote that letter was just so distraught that we could, as a church, put that on their property. But that's the whole point, and that's why we're here, to continue to bring this into the light and to share it with other people and to take it home to our churches and to continue to spread that to others. And again, just want to reiterate that hopefully last night was good for everybody, that everybody got some kind of peace. From the women's thing, I heard it was very impactful. For the men downstairs, I've heard a lot of good stories about what they got out of Matt's talk down there. It's just empowering to hear the stories of people talking about what they took away. And there's a lot of good things from Matt's talk last night. Were very good. And we look forward to him bringing it on again today, as well as tomorrow. But now Matt's going to come up and talk on the neuroscience of the addiction, right?
Yeah.
So come on up, Matt.
Absolutely.
Big welcome.
Everybody. Amen. Wow. I always feel so short around him. It's terrible. So, well, welcome. It's really a gift to be here, and it's a gift. It's truly a gift to be in a church that wants to talk about this. I've marketed to churches where I've sat in front of a pastor in big churches in Denver and Golden and Boulder and had the pastor look at me and say, "Matt, we really don't have that problem in our church." And I looked around his office and he goes, "Is there a problem?" I go, "It's a Christian church, right?" And it was just so delusional. And I'm just, "Sir, when you're ready to pray through your stuff, then call me." But so I love seeing churches that talk about a first century problem. And for me, some of you don't know anything about me. I haven't wrote a book. You can't find me on social media because I run a multinational global ministry without one single social media fingerprint, because I'm the anti-social media guy, because it got me in a lot of trouble. I did my master's thesis on Facebook and LinkedIn and infidelity, and it's amazing how filthy those places are. But my journey in addiction, primarily sexual addiction, started roughly between ages 5 and 6 years of age. I was a young kid who had a dad that was one of those guys. Loved my father. He was my best friend. But he was also a horribly inappropriate man. He used to call out women on the street in an object way, right? Look at the things on her and blah, blah, blah. And as a young kid, I figured out that my dad got a goof and it would make him laugh when I did it. I didn't even know what I was doing, but between ages 5 and 6 years of age, I was building this framework of turning women into parts lists. And about 3 years after that, I was pretty egregiously sexually abused for a 3-year period between ages 9 and 11, roughly, by a girl in our neighborhood, which was minimized for 25 years of my life because, again, put a notch in your belt, kid, and shut up about it. You're getting good information that your friends are going to be begging for in a lot of years, and it was horrible. So when I brought it to the men in my life, they weren't very safe about it. Now, I'm a cliche in a bunch of different ways. I'm Italian. I grew up Catholic. I'm from New York. But I did grow up with a dad that was very connected in the midst of his legitimate business to very large portions of organized crime from the 50s to the 2000s. I grew up in a strip club environment, and women became this framework of objects to be used, paid for, and played with for the pleasure of men at an extremely young age. Why? Because my dad used to drag me to all these places because there was no daycare. So men weren't safe, and then all of a sudden I became the non-threatening kid, and women were nice. And men smelled like booze and cigars, and they were scratchy, and then said hello to you. They'd walk up and go, "Hey, kid," right in the face. And women were always hugs, and they smelled good, and they were soft. So I had this big problem in this attachment with women where I needed to be validated by women. I had a mother who wished she never had kids. In fact, when I had my son, who's 9, I called up, I says, "Ma, we got a baby." And there's two sides of this. The first thing she said was, "Oh no, Matthew, are you sure you want to do this?" That was my mother about her grandson. But then she found out that he was born on December 12th, which was a big thing for my ma. I said, "Ma, we got a baby." And she goes, "Was he born today?" And I says, "Yeah." She goes, "No, the 12th, right?" I said, "Yeah, 12, 12, 13. What's the deal?" She goes, "It's Frank Sinatra's birthday. I can't wait to tell Mrs. Catalfo." I'm like, "Okay, Ma, good." But I grew up in a very, very affectionately devoted home. And I was constantly looking and seeking for validation and constantly looking for love and affection in the wrong places. And through that, I really developed a big problem with just relationships with girls. But once they got too close, women became an idol for me. And as soon as that idol stopped telling me how great I was, I had to discard it and find a new idol. And I really put women in this place. Yes, many waistlines ago, as I like to talk about. But in the space of that, I really didn't want anything to do with what my family was going through. My uncle was blown up in his car. My godfather was shot and killed coming out of the Blue Gardenia by Joey Sullivan. I watched a guy my dad cut a guy's finger off in my mom's kitchen when I was 9 and caught it on her stove over a gambling debt. I got a big hole in my hand from being stabbed from some kid who tried to take my wallet when I was 18. And I didn't like the violence, and it was a horrible amount of trauma. Not that I was trying to be that thing, but I did everything I could to get away from it. But I met my wife when she was 12. I was 15. She was a neighborhood kid. Fell in love with her. She was awesome. And I knew I needed to clean up my act, right? She was my cure. And I did, for the most part. But it took me 11 years to kind of convince her family that I wasn't my family. And but I did. I got married to her. She's a beautiful kid. And but in that, I was not the husband. We talked about being a Proverbs 31 man, sacrificing, being holy, pursuing. And I didn't do that. I was very much about my old world, and I just wanted a pretty trophy. And within that first 4 years of our marriage, I found out that my wife had stepped out on our marriage twice. And I was a coward, and I also had the emotional IQ of a 10-year-old because of my intimacy anorexia. So for the next 12 years, I went and blew up my marriage. And, there's something in Hebrews 12:2 that I'll talk about in a bit. It says that Jesus is the author and finisher of our stories. And sometimes we take the pen. And every time I took the pen, it was always a tragedy. I tried to write my own story. And I'll be honest, as a therapist and a psychotherapist, I work with roughly 300 people a week. I have 25 sex addiction and intimacy anorexia groups. Some of my wonderful guys here, you break my heart because you're out there. But seeing people get free comes with a lot of pain and a lot of realities that we don't understand in the scope of it. How do people get to this place where they do these things, or they watch this stuff, or they put another person through this? And I'm going to talk about that today here, because there's two realities that we shift into very well, but we also have to understand the concept of addiction. And whether you think this is an excuse that a bunch of celebrities that came up with to figure out how to justify cheating on their wife. There's more to it. There's more to it. And I was caught up in it, and I didn't understand it. But I needed to go after it. I got a pretty big brain. I sound like a meathead, I know, but but I went to Rochester Institute of Technology for mechanical design engineering and minored in sound engineering and plasma physics. But I need some science and data to go along with this. I haven't known the Lord that long. March 7th of 2012. I didn't want it. As I mentioned last night, I loved persecuting Christians and pointing out the hypocrisy. I thought it was quite amusing. All the Christian guys I knew that were preaching Jesus were also getting lap dances at my uncle's club on Friday night. At least I didn't have the guilt. And it was sad. But when I blew up my marriage, I went on the circuit. I went on the wife is a co-addict CSAT thing for a while. I'm not disparaging any other programs. There were a few programs that I started out with that didn't, my wife and I just weren't moving in that space. But I found one of the counselors who told me, Matt, there's really very little hope for your marriage, gave me a business card and told me to walk into Dr. Weiss's facility. If you guys are familiar with Dr. Doug Weiss with the Heart to Heart Counseling Center, I rent my office space out of his facility. I do not work for him, but I do volunteer there. And I led groups for him for 4.5 years before he kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you might make a good counselor, which is up for debate. But nonetheless, here I am standing before you just passing on the message of that which saved me. We did an intensive, and it saved our marriage. I put my marriage back together, and I grew up, and I changed my attitudes about some things. But there was some understanding about the actual addiction part of it that I really needed to dig into. Because as a guy with a big brain, and I need science and data to go along with it, sitting in front of a screen doesn't seem to osmosisly affect somebody in the way that my mind works. I had a very big drug problem with pot and cocaine, but there was a delivery system, and it was a substance. It was something that was entering. Now, there's guys that have done some really great work. Ted Roberts, for instance, with Conquer Series. He has a variety of pieces of information of kind of this is your brain and this is your brain on porn. But I still needed a delivery system, and because it just wasn't connecting for me. So I enlisted the help of one of my sex addiction instructors in the master's program I was in, and a raving atheist from Georgia Southern University, neurochemical scientist, brilliant man. Now, normally I write this out, but I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of the study because I think you'll find it interesting. We took a 1.5 years to find 100 men. 100 men that were having connected, intimate, relational sex with a monogamous, committed partner. Really long acronym. One guy, one girl couples. And we vetted them. We polygraphed them. We wanted to make sure these guys weren't masturbating. They weren't looking at porn. They weren't stepping out. We asked their spouses, hey, in the bedroom, do you feel like you're getting thrown around like the rodeo show, or do you feel like you're actually connected with your man in these spaces? And they said yes. It took us 1.5 years, 100 guys, 100 couples. I know this sounds funny, but it took us all of about like 4.5 days to find 100 guys that were caught up in self-sex, masturbation, viewing pornography, and then the whole what we call the anonymous sex thing, the transactional acting out partners, massage parlors, prostitutes, strip clubs, that kind of a stuff. And once we had the two groups, we wanted to find out, well, what is happening when people have connected, intimate, relational sex versus guys that are self-gratifying? So we did. We had the couples go into a room, consummate their relationship, and as soon as the guy achieved sexual release with the healthy couples, we put them in a spec imaging MRI with a contrast, and we wanted to see what was going on up here, activity and chemically. Well, it was really interesting because when guys had their sexual release with their connected, intimate partner, the prefrontal cortex, part of your brain right behind your forehead, everything happy, joyous, all your executive functioning, logic, reasoning, everything good happens up front. That lit up like a candle. Unbelievable activity. Then in the hippocampus and the adrenal glands, we noticed large amounts of two hormonal chemicals, vasopressin and oxytocin, really important. A couple little trace endorphins, and dopamine and serotonin, all of our feel-good chemicals, were running pretty heavily in the activity in these folks' brain. Everything was working really well. Vasopressin and oxytocin is very important because those are social binding hormone chemicals that your brain releases. It's why when your kids are sick, it breaks your heart. When your dog dies, it's a family member. It like shatters you. When your parents are sick, when your family members or people that you love dearly are going through such intense pain, you are chemically bonded to them because of the hormones that you release when you have those types of deep, intimate, connected relational connections with them. Everything seemed to be working great. A couple little trace endorphins, but it was a feel-good thing. All of the men reported when they had their release that it was yes. It was awesome, and it was joyous, and it was beautiful. But then we took the other guys, and we had them go into a room, and they masturbated to completion. But I needed a structure because I wanted to see, well, if it's such a porn problem, because that's all I hear, the porn addiction, the porn addiction, the porn addiction. Porn's a symptom. Why? Because guys masturbate a whole bunch of different places, completely devoid of images. In the bathroom, when their wife's sleeping next to them sometimes, in the job site, in their car. There's a whole bunch of places that guys get it done. So if it's a porn addiction, then why are we acting out without images? Well, it's an easy target. Yes, porn is bad. Trust me, I do work with enough human trafficking organizations to understand the statistics that you are watching people completely self-destruct in front of you on that screen. God's children self-destructing right in front of you. And it's a mess. And it lies to us. It tells us that women do things that they don't do. Sorry, guys, I know this sounds crass, but women don't walk through the room at your house and look at you and go, God, I wish I could put his penis in my mouth. She doesn't do that. She's classy, and she's beautiful, and she's the Lord's daughter. But pornography lies to us in many ways. And I hear porn addiction. It's a porn addiction. Got to get the guys off the porn. But here's the thing. If the Lord did a movement and removed all the sexualized advertising and the pornography from the world, you're telling me we wouldn't still have a sexual problem with guys in the church? Come on now. The Lord laid waste to 2 cities in the Old Testament that didn't have Wi-Fi. Let's be real about that. So I wanted to know what it was. So we had 50 of these guys look at images, 50 looked at no images, completed their task, got in the same machine. And it was amazing because it didn't matter whether images were there or not. What happened to their brains, regardless of whether there were images, was equal, but it was completely different to this group here. When guys masturbated to completion, the happy part of their brain barely lit up. Barely lit up in the happy part. But the fear, guilt, flight, shame, anger, and depression portion of their brain went off massively. Nobody masturbates and goes, yeah, baby, I'm ready for my day. It's a grungy, horrible feeling. I've even had guys say, well, the only reason I masturbate is because it helps me fall asleep. Okay, well, that's because of the part of your brain that is being affected by that. But what was really big was that there was not an ounce of vasopressin and oxytocin. There was no connection to that transactional thing that guys were doing with themselves. And it was a really big mess. Because if you take a guy who's been masturbating since 8, 10, 12, 13, 16 years of age, and he's been masturbating daily, weekly, monthly, and his brain isn't fully developed until his late 20s, he's been feeding an underdeveloped brain with a Schedule I narcotic. And when they found out, when those guys masturbated, the one chemical that did show up in large amounts was the trace endorphins that barely showed up over here. But they started flooding, the pleasure center of the brain started binding with the normal dopamine and serotonin and formed a completely different compound when guys were masturbating that did not show up with the connected, intimate, relational sex crew. And it's called an enkephalin. It's an endorphin. And it's funny is that the only time our brain pumps out that level of endorphins is when it's injured. You hear about a guy who cuts off his finger and doesn't feel it. Or there's a car accident. The guy's standing on the street and his buddy walks out of the ditch and his arm's missing. He's like, hey, what's up? It's like, it's this amazing thing. And when they tested it, they found out that the enkephalins that are released when guys are masturbating is 4 to 5 times more potent than morphine. So if you take a guy who's been masturbating all of that time before their late 20s, They've been feeding an underdeveloped brain with a Schedule I narcotic that's as powerful as heroin, and you wonder why it calls you back. The stress quotients are unbelievable. But there is repair of that. People can go from a negative brain to a healthy brain. Now, how they get there is through connected, intimate, relational contact. And I'm a realist, though. There are times where you need to rebuild trust. And there is this dynamic that your wife isn't just going to jump back on the train because she knows she can help you clean up your brain. There's one truth and one truth alone with the couples that I've worked with, and I think I've asked every one of them. Miss, if I could wave my hand over your husband and tell you he would never sexually act out again, would that be enough? As long as he's on this earth, he would never sexually act out again. Would that be enough? And I've never had a woman say, yep, that's all I need. Because there's the relationship. The women in this room that have been affected by sexual stuff are the most courageous creatures on the planet. You are courageous and beautiful and strong and amazing, and you've been through trauma and PTSD over this, and your feelings and your hurts are real, and they are valid, and you need to be celebrated. You do. Why? Because this betrayal is something that happened in many cases long. It was very much happening long before you came into these men's lives. I'll be honest with you, as many men as I've worked with, I'm up to about 5,000 men right now. I have not met one guy who woke up one day and said, what's the best way I could possibly put my wife's heart in a shredder? They don't wake up like that. But they're sick, and there's a moment because of the different realities, and I'll talk about that here momentarily, that they shift into. And it's very difficult because you have to deal with the betrayal of the porn. Better than 70% of the men in church, better than 42% of the pastorship. And that's a 2014 statistic. Struggle with sexual purity. Struggle with sexual purity. This conference should have tens of thousands of men in it, but they aren't there. And you guys as couples, you're here because you've been chosen. You've been chosen. Whether you came voluntarily, whether you think that you just happened to show up, or whether you did the last minute thing and came, you have been chosen to hear this message from everybody that's going to speak this weekend. Because there's freedom on the other side of it. There really is. But it comes with a lot of pain. It comes with a lot of partner betrayal. Ladies have to go through the betrayal of what's happened with their husband and the loss of the marriage. They have to go through some of the embarrassment when they walk into church and say, hey, what's your husband doing? Oh, he's a Conquer series. Oh, does he struggle with that? God, I'm so sorry. They have to deal with a lot of pain and a lot of stuff. And the version of us as men that show up, if we really want to clean this up, is the way to it. Dr. Weiss talks about believing behavior. Believing behavior is one thing. Judging behavior, that's a messy place. I'll be honest, some of the partners that I work with either really like me or they really don't, because I'm very challenging. But I because ultimately as a pastoral counselor, I want to see a marriage heal. Whether it's many of the women that are here, my wife included, I shot her. And if you've been shot, what you do with the bullet is important. You can be angry at the bullet. You can be mad at the bullet. You can just let the bullet fester inside you and you can bleed out. And that won't fix your marriage. Or you can do something with the bullet. And I really, really love when I see couples that do something with the bullet. As I mentioned, Hebrews 12:2, that Jesus is the author and the finisher of our story. When I lose marriages to divorce, most of the time it's because one person they want to take the pen and they want to write themselves out of the pain. The most beautiful moment that I have with couples that are healing from this craziness is when two people go, wow, this story sucks. This is not the story we ever wanted to be in. This is not the story we ever dreamed we would be in, but we're in it. And you know what? Eventually it's going to be for the Lord's glory. 15 years ago, if you told me this is what I'd do, and I would have chopped my arm off and believed it would have grown back. Because I never knew I could have the marriage that I had. I had to grow up, and I had to have my wife engage. For those of you that are stuck in the intimacy anorexia thing, the active withholding of emotional, spiritual, and sexual intimacy from your primary partner, right? The withholding from your wife. That's a messy thing because that leaves a woman very neglected and abandoned when she just wants to be loved, seen, heard, validated for who she is. Intimacy anorexia weaves a lot of masks together that we hang on our spouse to make her look ugly. And she's beautiful, but we're broken. And when two people embrace the story that the Lord has in them and realize that he's going to finish this story and it's for his glory, that is a powerful moment to see couples come out of because they take authority over themselves. And it's amazing to see two people grow in the midst of the brokenness. Intimacy anorexia, for the ladies, guys, it is a relational disorder that requires relational engagement. And if you wish not to engage with your guy and his IA, you should expect very little change from him. It's hard not to want to throw every knife in the drawer. And men, when those knives come at you, the call on you is to catch them, put them back in the drawer, and hear her, see her, love her, validate her, and stay in relational reality. I want to talk about that because when we look at this dynamic of sexual addiction and intimacy anorexia, it's almost unfathomable. One of the biggest questions. Well, if you loved me, how could you do this? How was I not the one whose eyes you have? I gave a worksheet. Do you guys have the worksheet on the object and the relational reality? Amen. I'll give you a second to get that out because it'll make the notes a little easier. If anybody needs an extra one, I think Tom might have one. If not, okay. So what happens that shifts a human being that's either caught up in addiction? Addiction is very much focusing on object reality, relational reality, and this is something that's interesting because not only does it affect the men, but it also affects the ladies, more so from a standpoint where they move from trust to mistrust. For the guys, it's a little different, and I'll explain that, especially in the brokenness and some of the, what I call the low emotional IQ that many of us men have. Does anybody else need one? Perfect. Thanks, Tommy. These two? We'll give it just a minute. Awesome. I think the young lady over here, next to the man in red. So with these sheets, I'd like to delineate the differences in these two realities, and I hope that this explains some things that you see happening. And I really think that this will be eye-opening to you because I think this is a missing dynamic for a lot of people as to how we get into some of these places. Now, when we are in relational reality, I believe that's at the top of the sheet, yes? Okay, thank you for the nods. When we are in relational reality, there are a lot of core belief systems, but I'm going to focus on 3 core belief systems. And I'm going to give you some vignettes as to how this plays out. Relational reality, core belief number 1, all people have value. Core belief number 1, all people have value. All people have value when we're in relational reality. Second one, core belief number 2, relational reality. It's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, use physical, verbal, emotional, or spiritual control or management of another person. It's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, use physical, verbal, emotional, or spiritual management of another person or control. Tracking with me so far? First core belief, all people have value. Second one, it's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, use physical, verbal, emotional, or spiritual control or management of another person. And core belief number 3, all behaviors have consequences. Good or bad. Every behavior, good or bad, has consequence. All behaviors, good or bad, have consequence. And I'll go through those again. The first one, all people have value. Number two, it's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, use physical, verbal, emotional, or spiritual control or management of another person. And number three, all behaviors have consequences, good or bad. Okay? There's good consequences, there's bad consequences. Now, when we are in relational reality, things are okay. Things are pretty good. You see each other as human beings. You see the value in your wife. She sees the value in you. You function well. When you got married, when you stood before the Lord and looked in each other's eyes and made promises, you were well into relational reality. There were times throughout your marriage where you may have been in relational reality, even after you found out about his stuff. They were very immature, but they may be few and far between. But when you're in relational reality, two people see each other as human souls with value. It's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, use physical, verbal, emotional, spiritual control or management, and that our behaviors come with cause and effect. But when we shift to object reality, the core belief systems are the same, but for a person who goes to object reality, they are skewed. Now, all I ask you to write down is how it's skewed, because it's the same core belief systems. I'm going to give you the skew. In object reality, all people have value. And here's what you can write down. As long as they're benefiting me, they're not attacking me, rejecting me, or belittling me. All people have value as long as they're benefiting me, not rejecting me, attacking me, or belittling me. Fair? They're benefiting me, not rejecting, attacking, or belittling me. The second core belief system in object reality is the same. In our heart of hearts, we know that it's not okay to lie, cheat, steal, and do all that stuff. But here's the skewed part in object reality. Unless I have to self-protect. Unless I have to self-protect. And the third one, plain and simple, I'm the judge of my behavior and determine my consequences. I'm the judge. There is no cause and effect. There is no good and bad. I'm the judge of my own behavior. I'm going to tell you whether or not anything I did was right or wrong, and whether anything I did warrants having a consequence. I'm the judge. Now, the one thing you'll notice about object reality is it is interlaced with what I call the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. Why? Because what happens when two people do these things, and I'm going to use a weird example, if you will. It's an example that Dr. Weiss has used in one of his videos called Unstuck, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. There was a time in New York City where Times Square did not have a Disney store. It was very much a filthy place. It was all peep shows and scumbag theaters. But in that moment, guys would go into a viewing booth and they would put a coin in a machine and the window would go up and there would be either a movie or a girl on the other side of it. But after a while, boom, it would slam shut unless they kept putting a coin in the machine, which would keep the window up and would keep the fantasy going. It was called coining. Now, when some guys have acted out, there's guys that look at porn and masturbate, but then there's guys that have acted out with another person, right? Maybe it's a prostitute, sex for money. Maybe it's two prostitutes, sex for money, sex for money. That person has no value because it's very transactional. It's sex for money in that space. But then he acts out with a girl who's not a prostitute. What about her? She means something different to you. And I hear this a lot from my partners. But you said things to her. I saw the text messages and the emails and the freaking communications with her. You told her you loved her and you did. Yes, he did. But she is no different than the prostitute. In his mind, there are some messy things that may think that it's not the same con, but it is, because when he's in object reality and he found a person who's not a prostitute, the currency changes. It's still the same con. Prostitutes are sex for money, but that woman, she is emails from sex, texts for sex. He'll never leave his wife. He's way too much of a coward to do that. He will go on and on and on and keep coining this fantasy with a lot of pieces of information that sound really relational. And on one hand, I can count how many guys would have actually left their wife for their acting out partner. But that's what happens, is that when they get so into object reality, that person has no value. They are a transaction. And sometimes in their object reality, they will use words and language that makes it look like they're in relationship when they're not. When they're not. I know, because the women that I was in a relationship with, I would have never, ever left. And I had to really come to grips that I was such a horrible person that I manipulated people for sex, but I didn't want to pay for it. So it was easy to use a different currency to get my needs met in a crummy way. And it demeans people, because it takes advantage of a whole lot of good in people. But sometimes we attach a meaning to that one person. But that one girl, she's not this. And it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But when you realize that she has no more value than the woman who's taking money for sex, hopefully it can clean it up for you. It may take some time. It may take some time for that. But what happens in communication, especially on the intimacy anorexia side of it, my wife has a lot of pain that used to come out. And she's Polish, Ukrainian, Italian, and she's from New York, and it used to come out very colorful in a lot of ways. Love my wife. But what would happen is, like, my wife's delivery would suck. You know, what's wrong with you? Not, hey, baby, what's wrong with you? Like, I always wanted it to have a little bit more sugar on it, and it never did. But I used to attach a meaning to that. She's emasculating and bitchy and guilting and shaming and mothering and critical and controlling. No, she's not. That's the meaning that I attached to it. But what would happen is, in that moment, I would behave what I believed about her. Why? Because I had a story. It wasn't true, but once I had a story about who I believed her to be, all it took was a drip of that to come out of her. And in those moments when she was in pain and I needed to hear her, see her, love her, and validate her, all of a sudden, I shift into my object reality. Now she is no longer benefiting me. I believe I'm being attacked, belittled, or rejected. So now she's no longer anything but an object. Not a sexual object, but I turn her into an object of contention. And what do I want to do? I either want to fix the facts of that person, or I want to fight that person. Why? Because now I have to self-protect. And this is why guys will lie to their wives. What do you mean you lie to your wife? Yes, you will. When you are in object reality, she has little value in that space. I know that's hard to comprehend. And the takeaway from this isn't to go home and say, I'm just an object to you right now. It's not, ladies, I'm sorry. But in that moment when you feel him pulling away and you think, oh my gosh, he's in object reality right now, that's why nothing that's coming out of him is relational at all. Ask him. Say, hon, are you in your story right now? What's the story going on in your head? Because I'm here and I love you. And yes, it may take you a little bit to figure out that that's what's going on. But when a guy shifts into that object reality, he won't handle your heart the way the Lord would. And conversely, for the ladies, your object reality looks a little different. You ask him a question, and some dumb look comes across his face. And you immediately shift into object reality yourself. Why? Because you don't trust it. And you move from trust to mistrust. So now something that actually may be genuine from a guy who's really learning how to increase his emotional vocabulary, well, you're a liar. You're lying. I know you're lying. He may not be. But he's stuck in that place where he's trying to grow And he may not have the words, and he might be just trying not to turn you into an object at the same time you're turning him into an object. And this gets messy, and it's a crazy battle. Because really good people, we create distance in what can be a relationship that's in repair moving forward because we get caught up. And we have relational needs to be heard, seen, loved, and validated. Yeah, he's got a lot of ground to make up. But he has a heart and he has a soul and he has some feelings. But the moment that you see him turn into something different, if he gets defensive, if he starts going to that range, guys, catch yourself, see where you are, because the moment that you believe you're being attacked, you may not be being attacked. But that's the meaning that you've attached to it. Why? Because she sometimes doesn't have great words in the midst of her pain. Sometimes she doesn't. And that's okay. But if we understand it for what it is, it's pain speak. That's what's coming out of her. That's why women get turned into things that they never ever dreamed they would ever be in this thing. They say things and they act in ways that it's so not who they are. But we have something called worldly sorrow as men, where we get all, I don't like how mom's talking to me right now, and I'm going to take my ball and go home. And we tend to create distance in those moments. And she's saying, no, moron, move toward me. I'm in pain. I need to be heard. Yes. And that's our job. I know this, I'm not trying to make light of this because this pain is very real. But the exchanges, the meaning that we attach to different things. My wife, I hear this all the time from guys. Oh, when she uses that tone of voice. Come on with the tone of voice. Her tone of voice doesn't mean anything except that's what you make it mean. Her tone of voice may suck. Embrace it. She's wonderful and beautiful and she's strong, and we should celebrate her strength. Not be all crazy because we don't like the tone of voice that she used with us. But that tone of voice only means that which you attach to it. If you've attached the meaning that your wife's tone of voice means she's mothering or emasculating, then you will behave what you believe about it. And that's a tough one for some of us. But as we start to grow and we grow together and we celebrate the beauty of who each other is, we really have an opportunity to stay in relational reality. I'm bringing this to you so that you can self-regulate. You can figure out, am I trusting the reality of what's going on right now? He took his polygraph last month. He's sober. I know this knocked me off balance a little bit, but maybe in the midst of my trigger, I need to get my word count out with one of the ladies before I bring it to him. We're going to talk a little bit about safety in the recovery environment in a later piece that I do with you guys tomorrow. Because I hear that a lot. He's not safe. He's not safe. He's not safe. It's not the guy's job who shot you to keep you safe. And we'll talk about that, because that statement hackles a lot of my ladies, and I'm very sorry. I'm not trying to hackle you because I want to explain it, and I'll show you as to why and where there's beauty and strength within you as you go through this. So I wanted to explain a bit, that's interesting, of the neurochemical piece to understand a dynamic of when a guy is caught up in addiction and they are living in object reality. The other piece of that is that when they're in front of that computer or with that acting out partner or at the massage parlor or whatnot, but if you loved me, how could you? Because yes, once he shifts into that object reality, those blinders go on. It is about the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. There's no consequences. There's no you. There's no kids. There's no loss of job. Literally, once every quarter, I go and speak at the Human Resources new hire meeting for Lockheed Martin, government contractor. Those guys are under federal indictment if they look at filthy stuff on government computers, and yet, every 6 months, they fire 5 or 6 guys and charge them federally with looking at illicit stuff on government computers. They know the consequences going in. Why? Because every quarter they stand in front of me as new hires, and I tell them. And yet they still go down these roads. Why? Because they get locked in to that object reality. Nothing, not even themselves, has value. And they will sacrifice everything in their life for a hit of that enkephalin that they've been chasing since they were little kids. So I hope that gives you guys a little bit of perspective to just kind of see what the heck's going on. and maybe at least put a name to, wait a minute, I'm your wife, and you're blowing me up right now. Oh, maybe it's because he's in his object reality, and I need to ask, what story are you in right now? And that should be your verbal cue, guys, to go, wow, I'm in my story right now. I need to call another brother and get another guy on the phone, because in those moments, men make men, and she is the wrong gender to turn you into who you need to be. Fair? All right. Well, guys, thank you for that. I hope the reason that I kind of wanted to touch on this in the way that I did is so that you guys will use the QR code in that book to go ahead and ask questions, because I know a lot of times you have questions, and that was part of the reason I wanted to do this piece to kind of kick you off, to get your wheels turning, so that you could go in, use that QR code, ask some questions, so when Mo and I are doing the Q&A, I'll be able to walk through some questions with you about it. Fair enough? Well, bless you. Thank you for being here. I'll turn things back over to Tommy. Amen.